Round the World Lit Audio. Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Episode 2. Sancho Panza, The Windmills, and Mambrino's Helmet. Full narration script. Channel intro. Welcome to Around the World Lit Audio, the greatest stories ever told, from every corner of the world, in English. New chapter every week, free to listen. Chapter recap. In Episode 1, Alonso Quixote's brain dried up under the weight of too many books of chivalry and he became Don Quixote de la Mancha, knight-errant, defender of the weak, servant of the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso, who was a farm girl from the next village, who did not know she had been designated a princess. He armed himself with rusted armor and a cardboard visor, named his old horse Rocinante, and set out before dawn. He was knighted by an innkeeper reading from an account book. He rescued a boy who was beaten worse the moment he rode away. He was beaten on the road by merchants, who would not confess Dulcinea's beauty without evidence. He was carried home by a neighbor. The books were burned. He planned his second sally. Episode 2. Sancho Panza, The Windmills, and Mambrino's Helmet. Sancho Panza. The second sally required a squire. The romances were clear on this point. A knight-errant traveled with a squire, someone to manage the practical dimensions of the adventure while the knight attended to the heroic ones, someone to hold the horses and carry the provisions, and bear witness to the deeds. Don Quixote had been meaning to acquire one. He had his eye on a neighbor. His name was Sancho Panza. Sancho Panza was a short man, with a round belly and a round face, and the specific quality of someone whose relationship with the world has always been mediated by appetite, for food, for comfort, for the simple pleasures of a man, who has never asked too much of life and has generally been satisfied with what he got. He was not stupid. He was not educated. He was a farmer, a practical man, a man who understood the value of things by their usefulness, who had the specific intelligence of someone who has always had to make things work. He had a wife named Teresa, and a daughter and a son and a donkey and a small farm, and the ordinary life of a man of his village. Don Quixote came to him. He said, "Come with me as my squire. If we go adventuring as I intend, you will be governor of an island before long." Knights-errant often win islands in the course of their adventures, and give them to their squires to govern. "I will give you an island." Sancho looked at him. He thought about the island. He said, "All right." This is the comedy and the tragedy of Sancho Panza in one exchange, the specific mixture of credulity and practicality that makes him the most fully human character in the novel. The man who knows perfectly well that his neighbor has lost his mind, and goes with him anyway because the island is worth considering, and because there is something in Don Quixote that inspires loyalty even from people who know better. He packed his provisions on his donkey, and they set out. Don Quixote on the thin Rocinante, Sancho Panza on his donkey. The two figures who have been inseparable in the world's imagination ever since, the tall thin idealist and the short round pragmatist, the man who sees giants, and the man who sees windmills. The partnership that has been called the two halves of the human soul. The windmills. They came upon windmills. There were 30 or 40 of them, large windmills on a plain in La Mancha, turning their arms in the wind with the slow mechanical certainty of things that have been doing what they do for a long time and intend to continue. They were visible from a considerable distance across the flat plain. Don Quixote saw them and stopped. He said, "Fortune is guiding our affairs better than we could wish. Look there, Sancho, 30 or 40 monstrous giants have appeared, with whom I intend to do battle and take all their lives. With their spoils we shall begin to make our fortune, for this is a righteous war." Sancho looked at the windmills. He said, "What giants?" Don Quixote said, "Those you see there, with their long arms. Some giants have arms almost 2 leagues long." Sancho said, "Look, your worship, those are not giants, but windmills. What look like arms are their sails, which are turned by the wind and make the millstone go." Don Quixote said, "It is clear you are not experienced in adventures. They are giants. If you are afraid, stand aside and say your prayers while I engage them in fierce and unequal battle." He put spurs to Rocinante. He lowered his lance. He charged. The wind turned the sails of the first windmill, and the arm swept around and struck Don Quixote and his lance simultaneously, sending him and Rocinante rolling across the plain, the lance broken into pieces. The knight and horse tumbled in the dirt. Sancho came as fast as his donkey could carry him. Don Quixote was lying in the field, unable to move, bruised and shaken. He said, "Peace, Sancho. The affairs of war are subject to continual change. I think, and this is the truth, that the sage Friston, who is my enemy and stole my library, has turned those giants into windmills to cheat me of the glory of overcoming them." Sancho said, "God grant it." He helped Don Quixote onto Rocinante. They continued. This is the scene that gave the language the phrase tilting at windmills, the phrase that describes any hopeless, misguided battle against imaginary enemies, Any passionate investment of effort and conviction in a cause that the world does not recognize as real. The phrase has outlasted most of the language of its century. It will outlast most of the language of ours. But the scene is more complicated than the phrase suggests. Don Quixote is wrong about the windmills. They are windmills. He is deluded. The charge is absurd and the fall is inevitable, and the bruises are real. All of this is true. And yet, the courage is also real. The willingness to charge, to lower the lance and put spurs to the horse, and commit completely to the battle against what you believe to be enemies, is also real. The problem is not the courage. The problem is the perception. And the novel keeps asking, from this moment forward, the question that the windmills introduce: what is the difference between courage in the service of delusion and courage in the service of truth, and how do you tell them apart from the outside? The flock of sheep. They continued westward. They had not gone far when they heard a great noise, the sound of something large approaching on the road behind them. Don Quixote looked back and saw a cloud of dust. He said, "This is the day on which shall be seen the boon my stars are reserving for me. This is the day when the might of my arm shall be displayed as never before. See that great army coming toward us, that host of diverse and countless peoples, who march to battle." Sancho looked. He said, "Where are the armies? I see nothing but a lot of sheep and rams." Don Quixote said, "Your fear has so muddled your brain that you cannot see properly. Stand aside." It was a flock of sheep. 2 flocks, actually, coming from opposite directions, raising dust, filling the road with noise. Don Quixote saw 2 armies. He charged into the sheep, his lance striking left and right, killing several of them before the shepherds drove him off with a volley of stones from their slings. He was struck in the mouth and lost several teeth. He fell from Rocinante. He said, when Sancho reached him, "Did I not tell you they were armies?" Sancho said, "Your worship is badly hurt." And those were sheep. Don Quixote said, "That enemy enchanter, who persecutes me, has transformed them back into sheep out of spite, to rob me of the honor of the victory." Sancho looked at the departing sheep. He said nothing. He was learning the grammar of Don Quixote's world, the specific grammar in which every failure has an explanation and every explanation involves an enchanter, and every enchanter is always conveniently invisible. He was not sure he believed this grammar. He was also not sure he didn't. He held the basin, Mambrino's helmet. It rained. A barber was riding toward them, on a gray ass, wearing a brass shaving basin on his head to protect himself from the rain, the basin inverted on his head like a hat, which was a practical solution to the problem of getting wet without a proper hat. Don Quixote saw the barber coming and said to Sancho, "Here comes a man wearing on his head the helmet of Mambrino, which I swore to take from him." Sancho said, "What helmet? That looks like a barber's basin." Don Quixote said, "It is the helmet of Mambrino, the finest helmet in the world. Stand aside." He charged the barber. The barber, terrified by a man in armor charging him with a lance, abandoned his basin and his ass, and fled across the plain on foot. Don Quixote took up the basin and examined it. He said, "The pagan who had this helmet melted down the better part of it to make money. What remains is half a helmet, but I shall have it completed when I can." He put it on his head. It was a barber's basin. It sat on his head with the specific wrongness of a round basin on a human head, tilting, too large, completely unsuited for the purpose. Don Quixote wore it with the gravity of someone who has just acquired a priceless artifact. Sancho looked at his master with the basin on his head. He wanted to laugh. He did not laugh. This is characteristic of Sancho at his best, the suppression of laughter, that is also a form of loyalty, the specific kindness of a man who sees the truth clearly, and chooses not to say it because the person who needs to hear it will not be able to receive it. Sancho was not kind in the sentimental sense. He was practical, and the practical calculation was that Don Quixote with Mambrino's helmet was the same Don Quixote as Don Quixote without it, and the basin was doing no one any harm. He called it the bason-helmet thereafter, a word he coined on the spot, neither basin nor helmet but something in between, a compromise between what he saw and what his master saw, a word that acknowledged both realities and committed to neither. The bason-helmet. It is one of the great comic coinages in literature, the word that tries to hold 2 incompatible truths simultaneously, the word that is Sancho's philosophy in miniature. The galley slaves. They came upon a chain gang, 12 men, chained together at the neck in pairs, walking in a column under the guard of men on horseback and men on foot with muskets. They were criminals sentenced to serve in the royal galleys, the ships that required large numbers of men to row, men who were not available voluntarily and had to be provided by the justice system. Don Quixote stopped them. He said, "This company of people in chains displeases me greatly. I know that force is being done to these people against their will." The guard said, "These are criminals condemned by His Majesty to the galleys. We are taking them there. There is nothing more to be said." Don Quixote said, Nevertheless, I would like to hear from each one of them the reason for his misfortune. He went down the line. He asked each man what he had done. The first had been condemned for being in love, he said, with a basket of laundry that he had stolen. The second for singing under torture, he had sung a confession. The third for being short of money. The fourth and fifth for various crimes. The last, Gines de Pasamonte, a large man who was chained more heavily than the others, and had a more dangerous quality about him, had been condemned for so many offenses that the paperwork was considerable. He said he had written his autobiography, which was better than Lazarillo de Tormes. He said he had not yet finished it because his life was not yet over. Don Quixote listened to all of them. He said, "It appears to me, from everything you have told me, that although it is a punishment for their faults, the sufferings they are about to endure do not please me greatly, since men are being forced into what is against their nature and freedom." He said, "I request, gently, that you unchain these men." The guard said no. Don Quixote attacked. He and Sancho and the galley slaves together, the slaves turning on their guards when the opportunity presented, overwhelmed the escort. The guards fled. The slaves were free. Don Quixote commanded them to present themselves before Dulcinea del Toboso, and tell her what he had done for them. Gines de Pasamonte said, "That is impossible. We cannot travel together. We would be recaptured. We must go our separate ways, each by his own road." Then they stoned Don Quixote, not out of hatred, out of the practical calculation of people who have just been freed by a madman, and are not interested in the further demands of the freedom. They threw stones until Don Quixote and Sancho retreated into the hills, battered and indignant. Sancho said, "I told you so." Don Quixote said, "You told me nothing." Sancho said, "I told you not to free galley slaves." Don Quixote said, "It is against the order of chivalry to complain of any wound." Sancho said, "I am not complaining of the wound. I am complaining of being stoned by the men we freed." Don Quixote said, "Peace, Sancho." Sancho said, "With pleasure." He ate cheese from his saddlebag. The hills were ahead. The adventure continued. Episode transition. You have reached the end of episode 2 of Don Quixote, by Miguel de Cervantes. Sancho has been acquired. The windmills have been charged and the giants defeated by enchanters. The basin of Mambrino has been won. The galley slaves have been freed and have stoned their liberator in gratitude. In episode 3, Don Quixote retreats into the mountains of Sierra Morena, and a complicated story of love and madness begins, with Dorothea and Cardenio and the curate's plan to bring the knight home. Episode 3 is available next week. Subscribe to Around the World Lit Audio so you never miss a chapter. A new episode arrives every week.